October's upcoming topic is Resolve NATO Presence Improves the Lives of Afghan Citizens. Since a couple people have been asking, here are some thoughts that I have on this topic and the way it's going to be debated in the next month. Obviously, it's really similar to a lot of people to January's resolution about Afghanistan and Obama's plan to increase troops there, but at the same time, this was going to be debated in a very different manner. I think a lot of people who are expecting it in the context of that are kind of misreading the resolution. There's a lot more overlap than one would think. The difference between this resolution and January's resolution is primarily in whose point of view we're looking at it from, rather than who is doing it. It does say NATO presence instead of U.S. troops, but at the same time, there's probably not too much difference in that because the way the words are interpreted are fairly similar, actually. So I'm just going to look at the actual wording of the resolution first and some of the ways this topic can be interpreted. Now, NATO presence doesn't mean NATO presence except the U.S. A lot of people are seeing it that way just because thinking, how is this different than January's topic? NATO presence includes the U.S. pretty much no matter how you look at it. The U.S. is a member of NATO. It would be like saying Allied presence in World War II. Includes the U.S., includes Britain, includes France, includes Russia, etc. NATO presence is a similar way, includes all presence in Afghanistan belonging to members of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or the ISAF to be precise, but again, there are a couple ways of looking at that as well. NATO presence in Afghanistan, the military presence at least, consists of the ISAF, the International Security Assistance Force. It went into Kabul shortly after the USA went in and became in charge of the entire country and integrated with the U.S. force sometime around 2003. Now, the ISAF may be the totality of NATO presence for this resolution, or it may just be a part of it. Where we enter the gray area is actually when we're looking at other aspects of the resolution besides just the ISAF. For instance, U.S. presence, we have a lot of troops in NATO. Then we have about 8,000 troops in addition to those 110,000 who are not technically in the ISAF, but are still a member of the U.S., who is a NATO country. So they may or may not count as NATO presence, these training troops and these counter-terrorist troops. So whether they are NATO presence in the ground is up for grabs. Similarly, a lot of the drone strikes we use for some of the more controversial actions taken in Afghanistan, particularly along the Pakistani border, are controlled by the CIA rather than by the U.S. military. So you can make the argument that is not NATO presence, even if the bulk of the U.S. military in the ISAF is. Either way, the majority of the debate is going to come down to how those slightly 100,000 plus troops are affecting the lives of Afghan citizens right now. And there's two real ways you can frame this debate, because you have to compare improvement to something. You can look at it as a case of before versus after, which favors the con, or with versus without, which favors the pro. When I say before versus after, what I'm primarily talking about is what was life like in Afghanistan in 2001, October or November of that year, versus what is it like now. Has NATO's presence made it worse or better over the past several years? This one obviously favors con more than the other interpretation because it looks at Afghanistan in peace versus an Afghanistan that's been war-torn for the past 10 years. Some drawbacks to this interpretation are that it doesn't account for alternate things that could have happened in the past 10 years. There's a lot of other problems that may have come beyond NATO presence. NATO presence may be a stabilizing influence, and it relies to some extent on predictions, which are kind of difficult. Then, on the other hand, there's the with versus without way of looking at it, which is saying you can't just look at this in a vacuum. You have to look at not just what was life like before NATO, but what would life be like if NATO suddenly disappeared. There's a more hypothetical way of looking at it, but it highlights more clearly for pro what NATO is protecting the Afghan people from, what they actually provide security against, and what Afghanistan would be like if a newly victorious Taliban, who is now more fundamentalist and more supported by al-Qaeda, suddenly comes into power. And that's one of the major problems there. So obviously, either team can debate under either interpretation. Neither one's an automatic win. Overall, I think this debate is slightly stronger for the pro side than the con side. The con can even that slightly by speaking first on this topic. I don't advise speaking first on every topic, but on this one, being first speaker definitely has its uses, particularly because you get to set the tone for the round, and particularly because you get to put spin on every crossfire immediately after it ends. And those will matter a lot on this topic, because despite what a lot of people don't like about them, there is a framework debate in this topic, and con absolutely needs to win it, not just to win the round, but to be able to debate in the first place. The resolution in and of itself has no weighing mechanism. It doesn't say, on balance, NATO presence improves the lives of Afghan citizens. It doesn't say, NATO presence improves the lives of most Afghan citizens. It doesn't say, NATO presence does more harm than good for Afghan citizens. It simply asks, does NATO presence improve the lives of Afghan citizens? Now, obviously, this it's not talking about all Afghan citizens, because the Taliban are Afghan citizens too by nearly any definition that you could possibly find. So at that point, it just does improve the lives of Afghan citizens. Here's a couple Afghan citizens whose lives have been improved, game over, if you interpret the resolution strictly literally, which is why Khan focused the debate on what should the resolution mean, what is debatable, and actually get that in the round, because if they don't, and a judge just asks themselves at the end of the round, is this resolution true, Crow is going to win the vast majority of the time. So Khan needs to start out by giving some way to measure this, and some way that each team can win the round. If we prove X, we win. If they prove Y, they win. This debate should be about Z, something along those lines. That actually creates clash instead of avoiding clash, like a debate with no weighing mechanism at all. Again, obviously, you don't want to use the words framework, burdens, prima facie, status quo necessarily when you're talking to a lay judge, to a citizen judge. But what you do want to do is have those terms in your head so that you know where you want this debate to go, what you want to prove, because otherwise you really can't even start debating this, which again makes Khan's really difficult and a really uphill battle. Anyhow, from there I want to move on to actually look at how you can measure improving lives, because there's a lot of different ways to look at it. You can look at literacy rates, you can look at crime rates, you can look at lifespans, you can look at healthcare, you can look at education. There's tons of different things that factor in with lots of different surveys. Each side is going to be able to find plenty of evidence that says exactly what they want it to. The trouble is, a lot of this evidence is going to be very disparate and very biased. So there will be two sources which have two opposite statistics by two interested biased parties. And the trick comes to actually deciding why one is true, or why they have incentives to be biased or have incentives to distort the evidence. For instance, we're going to look at drone strikes, because those have killed a lot of non-combatants, which have caused a lot of collateral damage. And this is measured very differently by the U.S. versus by independent commissions versus by Afghanistan. And if you look at those three, you'll see the Afghan government obviously has the highest casualty rates for these, whereas the U.S. has the lowest, but independent commissions somewhere in the middle. And part of this is because if somebody is killed in a drone strike, no way of identifying who they are, the U.S. is more inclined to assume that they must have been a terrorist and the strike was successful, whereas the Afghan government is most likely to assume this was an innocent civilian, they're just going to simply recruit more terrorists. This is going to be a big problem. So you can see how these statistics are problematic. A lot of teams on the pro side are going to fall into the easily avoidable trap of using statistics that come primarily from U.S. and NATO officers. And of course, they're going to say that they are doing a good job. Of course, they're going to say that they are succeeding. Even if they don't believe it, they would not be allowed to say otherwise to a news source unless they wanted to get fired a la McChrystal. So any source from NATO saying NATO is doing a great job is automatically suspect. Similarly, any source from the Taliban or from Taliban-affiliated media saying they're doing a terrible job, NATO is hurting Afghan citizens, is going to be equally, if not more, suspect. In that case, it doesn't really matter what the source says, it matters what warrants the source offers for that. Why does NATO say they're doing a good job? Can it be proven? Is there some external source to invalidate it? And similarly for the other side. What this actually opens up is the people in the middle, the Afghan citizens themselves, because a lot of them are going to be in the middle ground here. A lot of them are going to be in a situation where, yes, they do have a bias. They have a strong opinion on NATO one way or the other. But at the same time, it is a justified bias. It is a bias created by how NATO has interacted with them. If they feel NATO has hurt their lives, they're probably right. If they feel NATO has improved their lives, they're probably right there too. And it's going to be comparing these differing narratives and comparing these different biased sources and trying to establish some truth claim in the middle of all that is actually going to be the interesting part about this month's topic. So, a couple things that factor into this. I mean, Khan has two real options of how to strike out of this debate and how to attack this debate. They can talk about how NATO is bad in general, how NATO shouldn't be in Afghanistan, how it's a bad mission, how we're losing, and how it's going to be a failure. Or they can talk about how, from a more moderate point of view, NATO is good, but it is realist, it is self-interested. What NATO is actually doing is improving the lives of U.S. citizens and British citizens and French citizens and Russian citizens, but at the same time, it is not improving the lives of Afghan citizens, and that's the trade that they are making. So you're not arguing NATO is bad necessarily, you're just arguing that they are self-interested and they're helping their member countries and other neighboring countries more so than themselves. And obviously there are more players in this than just the Karzai government, the NATO countries and the ISAF, and the Taliban. There's many insurgents who aren't actually part of the Taliban, who are ideologues who just resent foreign intrusion in their country. Some of those are militias who work with the Taliban out of necessity. Some are entirely independent, simply dislike NATO, particularly British and U.S. components of it, because of what's happened in the past. Then aside from that, there's also a lot of other third parties, whether it's non-governmental organizations who are trying to provide the relief that NATO can't, whether it's groups like the Warlords, the Northern Alliance, who are private armies in and of their own rights, who on the one hand grow the same kind of drugs the Taliban do to fund themselves, and aren't above dealing with the Taliban but who don't like them and will fight against them when we pay them to, but who, despite taking bribes from us, will still then go ahead and hinder or outright fight against U.S. forces and NATO forces in some cases. So those third parties are definitely a factor in this. And if NATO has empowered those third parties, and those third parties are worse than the Taliban or better than the Taliban, that becomes a subject of debate in and of itself. So there's a lot of things that can factor into that. Other third parties are obviously going to include the ISI, Pakistan's intelligence service, and their Iranian counterparts, but at the same time, those are going to more affect the world as a whole, rather than Afghan citizens in particular, and they're probably not worth going into too much, just educating yourself in the background of, so that you can bring the debate back from them to Afghan citizens when the other side actually tries to do something about them. Now, what NATO is actually doing falls into a few different categories. First off, NATO is working with infrastructure. They're building roads, they're increasing education, they're increasing the amount of hospitals, medical care available, increasing the amount of jobs by training people and funding the Afghan army. There's many more people in the Afghan army and police force than there were before this, and as a result of that, you actually see the standard of living going up as far as employment rates go, as far as average wage goes, etc. On the other hand, the money may not be worth as much, and people who are being paid to just fight against other Afghans may not be the best measure of life improvement, even if it would be a good measure in a stable first world country otherwise. There might be other more basic measures here, such as the collateral damage caused by this fighting by both the Taliban and by NATO, that really takes casualties out of innocent third parties. So infrastructure is one thing that can factor in, but it can be outweighed. Another thing that can factor into this is just the amount of violence. And obviously Afghanistan is a more violent place now than it was before. And part of that just has to do with the kind of rights that are being granted and the kind of change that's taking place. It's easy for pro to argue that NATO is creating these rights in a beneficial way, that NATO is actually doing more good than harm by these, even if there are growing pains, and the Taliban's backlash is the Taliban's fault and not the fault of NATO presence, and shouldn't be conflated with NATO presence or the resolution. For instance, women's rights. On paper, they've increased a lot. Women are not property, women are able to serve in the police, they're able to serve in the armed forces, they're able to be elected to government, they're able to vote. All of these are big changes from the Taliban regime. So this difference between Sharia law and the status quo is one that could be in favor of NATO. Again, though, I said on paper. In reality, violence against women has shot way up since NATO went in, since the U.S. occupation back in 2001. Now, it's died down over the past few years, but it's still higher than it was. So again, are you comparing with versus without, or before versus after? And there's a couple of dimensions to this argument that complicate it. The first, like I alluded to before, is the idea of growing pains. That is to say, this is violence that is inevitable because of the change. The Taliban are lashing out against women because of what they're actually doing, but at the same time, this would happen when they got the rights anyway. The only alternative would be to never give women rights in the first place, and that would be a big problem. Now, instead of that, the way that Khan wants to focus it is, this is violence being caused by NATO. This is precluding the ability for peaceful change in the future. It's not like the country couldn't liberalize through free trade. It is simply something being caused by war and is being used to justify the war, and is actually causing more violence against women and children than would be seen otherwise. So again, that can be spun in either direction by either team. The big question, though, is this NATO presence? Is something NATO can be held responsible for? And that takes us to the last big area that NATO affects people, besides rights, besides security, and besides infrastructure. And that is what NATO is actually aiming for. Because again, this is a two-pronged argument. NATO is trying to support the Karzai government. NATO is trying to support expanding it over all of Afghanistan and to make it stable under the rule of that government. Whether that is better or worse than the Taliban is obviously going to play a big part in whether or not NATO presence improves the lives of Afghan citizens. If it doesn't improve the lives of Afghan citizens, obviously Crow is out of luck, but if you can prove this government is slightly better, or just that supporting government will lead to other better governments in the long run, then you can actually get away with this on Crow. Khan, I think, wants to attack Karzai more than it wants to attack NATO itself in the vast majority of situations. If the government we are supporting is worse, then it doesn't matter how good NATO presence is. Again, though, there is a second dimension to this. There is a trap that con can fall into that can be a big problem. Many times, I've seen con teams on paper start to write our arguments saying, well, this is going to all be reversed once NATO leaves. NATO may be helping a lot, but they've got a withdrawal timetable. We'll be pulling out in 2011, and as a result of that, it'll go back to the Taliban, so NATO presence isn't helping at all. The trouble with that argument is that the resolution does not ask about the long term. It doesn't ask, will NATO's presence create a useful, stable transition in 2011? What Khan has accidentally succeeded in doing in this hypothetical debate is proving that life without NATO presence will be worse than life with NATO presence, which goes a long way to proving the exact opposite of what Khan wants, and showing NATO presence is, in fact, a net good. So that's one thing to definitely avoid on Khan. You don't want to talk about withdrawal. You want to look at it just as a litmus test, with versus without, or before versus after. And again, before versus after favors Khan a little bit more, because you get to compare a country at peace, though a country that's not too much like us, versus a country that's really war-torn, but who we're blowing up for their own good. And I think that's the way Khan really wants to be framing this debate. Again, the Karzai regime is another problem in and of itself. Aside from allegations of corruptions in elections, aside from the fact it's not particularly representative, aside from Karzai's past as a warlord himself, it's just a question of who are we saving Afghanistan for? Will this help the Afghan people? By saying Afghanistan and creating conflict, are we just empowering the warlords? Are we just building up private armies, people who thrive on conflict more than we're encouraging stability? Regardless of whether or not any of this outlasts us, the question becomes, is NATO's presence actually a net good or not? And there's a lot of things, like I said, that can factor into that. But whether the end goal is nation building, or the end goal is democracy, or the end goal is some kind of mercantilist neocolonialism or something along those lines completely depends. Is NATO trying to use Afghanistan for its resources? And some people accuse the U.S. of. Is NATO as a whole doing that, or is the ISAF different? Do they actually have Afghanistan's best interests at heart? And regardless of what interests they have at heart, what is their presence actually doing? Are they improving the lives of Afghan citizens, or are they increasing risk? And again, there's going to be a lot of conflicting sources on this topic. There's going to be a lot of complexity on this topic. Teams who can make it simple. Teams who can tell a judge what to measure, what to weigh against what, and how to look at the round are going to be far, far ahead because there's so much information, so much of it biased, so much of it conflicting on this topic, that a team who helps the judge write their ballot is going to be very far ahead and very useful in a debate like this. So again, do research, borrow stuff from people who are debating policy on this topic if your school has a policy team. Don't use the cards directly, but read the articles. Borrow stuff from your varsity who have debated January topic, but again, don't assume you're still trying to prove the same thing, but just read up as much as you can and take in as much complexity as you can so that you can then go ahead and make this simple for your judge. The more complex your understanding of these issues are, the simpler you can make the rounds be, the easier you can group like arguments together, outweigh things, supersede things, whether it's just on the basis of timeliness, whether it's on the basis of inevitability. There's a lot of things you can factor into this besides just our impact is bigger and more likely than your impact. Because what Afghan citizens actually want is as much up for grabs as anything else in this debate, whether it's cultural relativism, cultural imperialism, somewhere in the middle, whether we are doing this for their own good, whether what we are doing will outlast us at all of these factor into the topic hugely, and all of these can decide whether or not NATO presence improves the lives of Afghan citizens. If you have questions about a specific argument, a specific case, a specific fact, a specific source, by all means, leave me a comment or email me, and I will get back to you. That's about all I have on this from an extemporaneous analysis at the start of the topic. I can tell you more after a couple tournaments. Thanks for listening. I hope this helps you guys in your tournaments.